Coming in at number 5, need more children. If anyone ever says this phrase to you, feel free to run away at speeds previously unknown to man, or knock them out. You have my full support. However, if the individual in question ends up being a Wendigo, then you're probably not going to have much luck with either of those tasks. They're just too strong and too spooky. And they get what they want most of the time, as evidenced by the story told by a now deleted Reddit user. I wonder how they're doing these days. I'll do my best to abridge this story for the sake of the length of today's video, so here we go. A man, his girlfriend, and their 3-year-old son all went out of town on a camping trip. At the behest of his superstitious partner, our storyteller packed the classic camping supplies, plus a shotgun, rifle, combat knife, and machete. When they reached their campsite, they noticed that the park rangers were kind of on edge and didn't seem to notice that they brought a whole pile of weapons. Odd. Onwards they trudged though and set up camp. That night they witnessed a horrible scene. It looked like someone had brutally killed a large animal, a buck perhaps, and dragged it away by the antlers. Not an easy task by any metric. Unnerved but resolute, they ate dinner and fed their son, then went to bed. In the middle of the night, a strange noise echoed throughout the woods, waking the man. He sat up and heard what sounded like muffled crying, prompting him to peek outside of the tent. What he saw he couldn't quite explain. It was like an enormous deer, slightly misshapen with enormous antlers and a strangely human presence about it. The man didn't need to see anything else. He pulled out his gun and shot it multiple times, causing it to bleed and shriek. It didn't die though, and before it disappeared into the night, it said the words, "Need more children." The man and his panicked wife then passed out. The panic didn't disappear the next morning either, as their son was not in the tent with them. They called the police, who arrived to investigate the blood left by the creature, and the man seemed to overhear them say something about it getting more bold. Unfortunately, their son was never found. Coming in at number 4, the Texas Wendigo. Traditionally, Wendigo are only found along the East Coast forests, around the Great Plains of the United States, and in the areas surrounding the Great Lakes. It's not often that you'll hear stories of them coming from other places, but parts of Texas are indeed located upon the Great Plains. And this Wendigo in particular made quite the name for itself in the area. From 2016 onwards, folks from the Yorktown, Texas area reported seeing a hulking figure almost 10 feet tall lurking around forested areas. It became such a common sight that a lot of people decided to avoid the woods altogether for a while. One intrepid explorer wanted to get a closer look at the thing, so he started frequenting the spots that it was most often sighted. During his search, he heard many noises characteristic of a Wendigo, the sounds of wounded or dying animals, human-like shrieks, and even basic sentences, all meant to entice him into the woods. Whoever this guy was knew the Wendigo's tricks though, and stayed well away from anywhere he'd be vulnerable. One evening, with plenty of mist still hanging in the air, he ran into the real deal. In an opening, he saw an old metal structure and 2 white houses, and between them a tall, lanky figure. It seemed to be spying on the inhabitants of these homes with devious intentions. He tried to ignore it as best he could as it walked along the path. Suddenly, a wave of overwhelming dread hit him and he got to running. Looking back behind him, he noticed that the Wendigo was now on all 4s, but still stood at around 5 feet tall. Thankfully, it didn't give chase, as the man theorizes that this was because the Wendigo was more interested in the housebound prey. To this day, he still thinks about its bone-white skin, bald head, dark black eyes, and humanoid face. He hasn't revisited the area. Coming in at number 3, we've got the frogs. Sometimes a story will draw you down one path and then pull out a twist so devious your spine will stay tingled for weeks. This is just such a tale. What do frogs have to do with the Wendigo? Well, just sit back and listen and I'll tell you a tale. This comes from Reddit user Unathana, who has a long history of listening to frogs make noise at night. When they were a kid, their grandmother would reassure them that the croaking was actually good, as it kept the Wendigo away. Over time, they got used to the sounds and actually found them quite soothing. Flash forward many years, and Unathana is enrolled in post-secondary education, taking a course on Native American literature. The Wendigo that they're learning about here is described a little differently than they remember their grandmother talking about. Frogs don't really do all that much to protect against such a creature. A damn shame. They then moved to a new place on the edge of town within a stone's throw of a pond just packed with frogs. The noise was once again comforting to them, and they tended to keep their windows open to hear them and enjoy the balmy summer heat. However, the night they recounted this story, things were different. Gone was the heat as well as the sound of frogs. In fact, it was unseasonably cold and the night was quieter than ever. This did not bode well for Unathana, not one bit. Every passing second meant more dread, with nowhere to run or hide. The Wendigo is out there somewhere. Better watch out. Coming in at number 2, we've got Anansi's Goat Man. one of the best known Wendigo GREENTEXT tales. The proliferation of spooky encounter stories on 4chan's paranormal board had a large impact on creepypasta culture in the early 2010s, usually told from a first-person perspective in bullet point form. Well, Anansi's tale starts as a GREENTEXT, maybe to entice more readers to stick around, but soon becomes a more traditionally written story. It chronicles his trip out to Alabama to visit family and the very strange things that happened while in the rural landscape. He and some cousins went out to a little cabin/trailer in the woods and brought some neighbors and other local kids with them. At first, it was just a smell, something like copper or blood that washed over the area. Nobody could explain it, so they tried to ignore it. Then strange figures appeared in the trees making awful noises. Folks were freaked out, so they ditched the fire and went inside, which resulted in plenty of loud bangs at the door. Understandably, lots of people were scared and wanted to leave, but trekking back through the woods late at night with no weapons with all this going on seemed like a bad idea. They decided to stick it out till morning and then leave once whatever rednecks in the woods stopped messing with them. Soon they realized that there were 12 people in the cabin at some point, and now they were just down to 11. Uh-oh. So the next morning, some people left, but Anansi and his buddy Tanner stuck around with a few more folks. The copper smell came and left over and over again, and soon enough they realized that one of the people they were with was acting weird. She ran off slack-jawed into the woods and nobody saw her again. Tanner's cousin showed up later with a gun and claimed to have seen that girl gibbering alone in the woods. He tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond. Weird. On the last night everyone was at the cabin, somebody fired at the figure in the woods, causing it to scream and thrash for hours. During this time, everyone tried to get some sleep in the cabin while Tanner stood guard with the gun. Half asleep, he noticed someone come in from the bathroom and fall asleep on the floor. But that put their head count at higher than he remembered. It's a bad sign. Just to be safe, he continued to pretend to sleep in the guard chair and noticed that the new addition would convulse and thrash around from time to time. The next morning, everyone left except Tanner, who said he'd lock everything up. Checking the bathroom that the extra body came in from, he noticed that the bathroom window was wide open. Whatever this creature was, it was infiltrating their cabin and pretending to be another person the whole time. Horrifying. And finally, at number 1, we've got the gun nut GREENTEXT. We'll cap off this list with one more GREENTEXT similar to Anansi's story, but with a different twist. A group of friends from college decided to take a trip out to an uncle's cabin. The stench of blood and copper was just as prevalent here, and over time, the strange event stacked up. The friends heard their own voices off in the woods, calling out for people to come find them. Dead animals were left all over the property, culminating in 2 halves of a deer being thrown at the side of the cabin. Thankfully, these pals were all a bunch of gun nuts with experience making homemade thermite, and when the going got bad, they got to work. Preparing to leave the cabin in the middle of the night, they had different roles for dealing with their Wendigo assailant. Some took point with rifles, while others packed their things. But at the last moment, after one pal went running off into the woods to see what he could find, they noticed something odd. A figure looking like their friend who had just run off was in the back of the cabin, appearing extra disheveled, pretending to pack up with the rest of them. This was their sign to open fire, and toss one of their homebrew thermite grenades after it. Even then, they can't be sure that they actually put an end to whatever shape-shifting creature was stalking them. The cabin ended up as ash though, so they're not planning on visiting anytime soon. Coming in at number 5, we've got the STALKER challenge. Right on, you might hear that name and think it's one thing, but it's actually probably not the first conclusion your mind lands upon. The STALKER challenge isn't about following someone around or testing a pal's skills at going unnoticed in the dark. It's actually a reference to a popular PC game called STALKER, where players explore an alternate reality Chernobyl exclusion zone. A lot of folks praise it for its lonesome and isolated atmosphere and the more realistic gunplay. Plenty of online military enthusiasts, survivalists, and Tarkovsky fans enjoy the game, so when we say that this Wendigo sighting was a result of the STALKER challenge, we can probably assume the writer was a fan of STALKER and wanted to experience living life solo in the wastelands for a while. During this temporary hermitage, he worked his way into the middle of nowhere with nothing but some vodka, guns, and a harmonica. Like a true survivalist, he hunted some small game, made a meal of it, and explored the surrounding area. Snacking on the rabbit he'd hunted, he heard some rustling coming from the bushes, but didn't think anything of it. The next day, he was startled awake by some screaming. Weird, especially considering how far he was from civilization. Grabbing his rifle, he went off in the direction of the scream. It didn't seem to come from one singular location, and eventually the writer got lost. After a long day wandering around, he found his way back to the camp he'd set up, but now somebody else was there. There was a humanoid form in tattered clothes staring down at his fire pit, unmoving. Worried that this person might be injured, the writer called out to him. No response. After a few minutes of standing there staring at him, he again asked if he was alright. The humanoid figure turned to him and said, "I wouldn't worry about it." This set off alarm bells for the writer, who began to back away. At that point, the humanoid mentioned that he could go for another meal right now, prompting the writer to book it out of there. Hearing the humanoid running behind him, he turned around and shot blindly, apparently finding his mark. The creature screamed, the same scream from earlier, and seemingly disappeared. The writer eventually made it to the road and encountered a car. He didn't look back. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Nebraskan Wendigo. If you weren't already wary of traveling alone in Nebraska, now you've got a whole new reason. That's right, a new spooky story of someone's close encounter with a third kind. Maybe not an alien, but hey. This tale comes from a guy who was a farmhand when he was younger. One night, the farmer he worked for asked if he could figure out who was trampling all the corn stalks at night. Excited to take on guard duty, the farmhand stayed up to see if he could catch the culprit. Armed with the farmer's shotgun and the advice not to shoot unless absolutely necessary, he hung out in a lawn chair and walked around the field a few times. Eventually, he heard rustling from within the cornfield, followed by what sounded like giggling children. This, of course, was the most unsettling moment of the farmhand's entire life. Not wanting to hurt kids, but also not wanting to get children of the corn, he brandished his gun and told them to leave unless they were looking for trouble. The giggling stopped and the rest of the night went smoothly. However, the next morning the farmer discovered something a little more disturbing than trampled corn. His cow, which had been left in the barn, was totally exsanguinated. All the blood in this animal was removed somehow and didn't leave any on the floors. The farmer called the cops and somehow managed to land on the explanation that it was some idiot kids, but the farmhand didn't quite buy that. However, the following night both the farmer and the farmhand stayed up to see if they could find anyone. The farmhand, sitting in his chair again, heard the giggling once more. This time he asked whoever it was to reveal himself, prompting a gigantic humanoid creature with antlers to shuffle out of the field. Bad call, to be honest. The farmhand shot at the beast and began to run away. During his flight, he was tripped by a gopher hole and fell to the ground hard. Suddenly it was morning and the farmhand was back inside the house, surrounded by the farmer's family. The farmer had told the cops that he was attacked by some random guy, but he chased him off. However, afterwards, the farmer took the farmhand aside and told him that he saw the beast too. It was on all fours after the boy tripped, and it took 6 shots from his rifle to scare it off. From then on, they didn't go out after dusk, and they kept guns on them at all times around the farm. Coming in at number 3, we've got a Nevadan Wendigo. Not Nebraska, Nevada. This is a different tale, although curiously enough, the protagonist of this story is the same age as the protagonist of our farmhand extravaganza. Funny how that works. While exploring some abandoned mine shafts, great idea I know, this lad felt as if he was being watched. Moving right along, he eventually encountered some old abandoned cabins. After looking through, he found a well, and this well stunk to high heaven, a strange, acrid, coppery smell, sort of a mix between fresh blood, rotten meat, and pennies. Not wanting to be around it anymore, he decided to head back towards the mine shafts. However, when he did, he saw something crouching inside of one. At first, he thought it was a mountain lion, as he'd seen them around these parts before, but then he realized how big the thing crouching in the shaft was. The openings were usually 8 to 10 feet tall, and this thing couldn't stand up straight inside of it. It moved towards the opening, revealing a bunch of matted brownish fur, and then it screamed. The kind of scream that haunts your dreams until the end of your life. Our explorer pal felt his blood go cold and immediately shot at this creature with his rifle. A few rounds to the torso did nothing to stop it, however, and it continued to scream. Time to run. He scrambled away, jumping over fallen trees and occasionally turning back to fire quick pot shots and check if it was close. Eventually he made it back to his truck and hightailed it out of there, averaging 60 miles per hour. He drove without stopping until he got home where his dad was waiting. His dad asked him how the trip went and where he ended up, noticing that his son was quite shaken. When our mineshaft exploring storyteller explained to his dad where he'd been, his dad appeared concerned and told him to never go back to that location. They didn't talk about it again. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Allegheny Forest Encounter. As I find more and more of these stories, I realize how absolutely terrifying the forest can be. Did I realize this as a kid when I went camping, or when I decided to go way off track while visiting remote cottages? Probably not, but I'm still here, right? This story comes from a hunter and his seasoned outdoorsman buddy. They'd gone fishing in the woods and made sure to prepare adequately. Black bears around that area, so they had their guns with them. After encountering a mangled deer corpse, they were a little unsettled. However, they chalked it up to a bear or maybe some coyotes and kept moving. A little while later, something set off the buddy's spidey senses and he asked for his gun. Moving to the middle of the creek, they saw a bear running through the woods full tilt. It was followed pretty closely by a deer headed in the same direction. But why would a deer be chasing a bear? Well, it wouldn't. Something was chasing both of these creatures, something huge. From afar it looked like a massive deer with superimposing antlers, but as it ran, it noticed the two hunters and moved towards them. When it got up close, they realized that it had a huge maw full of teeth that could only be described as belonging to a carnivore. That was all the warning they needed. Shooting at the beast while running away, they made sure to put as much distance between them and it as possible. Eventually they made it to a plateau where nothing seemed to be wrong. Reloading their weapons and looking around for any sign of trouble, they realized realized they were in the clear. Miles from their base camp, they hiked all the way back on high alert but never encountered the creature again. Even now, they have no idea what the hell they ran into. And at number 1, we've got another farm experience. This one doesn't stem from working on a farm though, it stems from living on one. When the writer was about 13, he and some friends lived in a rural area and would often get together to goof around in the woods. Meeting at one friend's farm, they chased each other around with sticks for a little while. However, our narrator ran off and stumbled upon a dead deer with some limbs missing. This led to the discovery of a bunch of dismembered animal parts strewn about the entrance to the woods. At that point, most of the friends went back to the farmhouse, while our fearless storyteller and a couple more pals went to investigate. This expedition resulted in the discovery of a dead cow with missing ribs, broken legs, and a head picked clean of soft tissue. Yuck. That was it for the night, and everyone got home safe. About a week later though, while hanging out near his house, the storyteller heard what he thought was his dog. Thinking it would rush out of the bush and beg for a treat, he wandered in the direction the noise was coming from, but what came out of the bush was not his dog. It was a shambling abomination, walking around like a newborn doe, covered in viscera with teeth as sharp as knives. Needless to say, he ran right inside. That night, while gripping a baseball bat in bed, he heard an awful scratching upon the wall outside his room. As this happened, his dog started freaking out, barking at the back door. Our storyteller rushed downstairs and grabbed the dog, double checking that his door was locked, and he stayed up all night listening for more. The noises eventually subsided and dawn broke. In the morning light, he peeked outside the door and saw an assortment of pig's feet strewn about the porch. Yikes. Coming in at number 5, we've got Jack Fiddler, Wendigo Hunter. And we'll kick this one off with not 1, not 2, but 14 purported Wendigo sightings. Possibly more if Jack wasn't able to get them before his untimely death. Back in the day, there was a man who claimed to be able to kill Wendigos. This man was known as Zauno Hishigo Galbo, but European settlers just knew him as Jack Fiddler. He lived in what's now known as the Sandy Lake First Nation and was a well-respected healer. He would go from community to community, ensuring the health of many people, but often he was sought out for more macabre business, fighting cannibalistic creatures. Jack would euthanize anyone who felt that the curse of the Wendigo was upon them. They sought him out to end their lives before they caused any trouble for their loved ones in their communities. Potions and ceremonies would mitigate damage, but death was the only surefire way to end a Wendigo's curse. And even then, it's a little tricky to deal with. So Jack would go from place to place, ensuring that Wendigos truly found their final resting place. After euthanizing the cursed individual, he would also perform a ritual cremation and burial to seal it away for good. Tales of his exploits eventually reached the Mounties though, who did not seem to think what Jack was doing was community service. After some investigation, they found out about a woman who was thought to be possessed. She was choked to death by her father-in-law and his brother. Any guesses as to who the brother was? Jack Fiddler. So the Fuzz arrested the men, claiming that what the law forbids, no pagan belief can justify. Jack eventually managed to slip away from the police before his trial and killed himself to avoid the long arm of the law. 14 counts of murder is a tough sentence, especially when assisted suicide and demon hunting were not considered valid defenses. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Wendigos of Blackwood Mountain. Boom. Butterfly effect. This pod of people eaters comes from the choose your own horrific adventure game Until Dawn, featuring a pre-Bohemian Rhapsody Rami Malek. In this game, you make decisions that will end up sealing the fate of 8 unlucky vacationers. See, this group of pals decided to return to Blackwood Mountain a year after a tragic disappearance. They brought some friends up and pulled a nasty prank, resulting in one running off into the night. What the friends might not have known is that the area had been frequented by Wendigos for centuries. European miners came to the area back in the 1800s and were warned off by natives who claimed the mountain was sacred. As settlers tend to do, they ignored this advice and started excavating anyways. In doing so, they released the Wendigo spirits. Later on, in the mid-1900s, a group of miners came back for some of those sweet, sweet minerals. They fell victim to some unfortunate accidents though and found themselves trapped in the mine shafts. Forced to cannibalize to survive, the remaining miners became Wendigos. After a powerful Wendigo was killed, its spirit was transferred to the unfortunate friend who ran off into the night. And you guessed it, this unfortunate individual came back with a vengeance. One by one, depending on how you play it, people fall victim to the Wendigo of Blackwood Mountain, sometimes becoming terrible creatures themselves. So next time you're in a survival situation, ask yourself if it's worth eating people and becoming a depraved monster in order to live. I'd take the long nap, to be honest. Coming in at number 3, we've got Pet Sematary. If you've only seen the movies based on this Stephen King tale, you might be a little confused. The feature films tend to skim over the folklore at the core of this resurrectory story. Sure, the ground is soured and stuff comes back to life, but why? Well, if you crack open a spicy little paperback, you'll find out exactly what happens. The spirit of a Wendigo plays a big part. The Creeds move into a lovely home near Ludlow and immediately run into trouble. The kids are getting hurt and the cat is killed by a passing vehicle. And soon enough, they learn about the Micmac burial ground near their residence. Apparently, it was abandoned because the ground was sour. Soon they learn some tales detailing the Wendigo that lived around there. It would walk through villages late at night, and anyone touched by it would develop a taste for human flesh. Eventually, it touched the burial ground itself, souring it and causing anything buried there to be possessed by it. This Wendigo spirit seems to orchestrate all sorts of terrible events in the story, playing with the emotions of the people around the Creed house. Some say that the Wendigo even manipulates the grief of everyone in the tale, causing them to act against their better judgment. Through this, it can possess more people and cause more terror. The horror of the Wendigo runs deeper than just the hunger for flesh and physical strength. Coming in at number 2, we've got Wendigo psychosis. There is some debate as to whether this disorder is real or not. If you look to the origins of the Wendigo legend, you can find plenty of association with the depths of winter. Without readily available food, often First Nations people would be subjected to famine. One who would indulge in the taboo of human flesh was considered to be possessed by an evil spirit, one that would never be satisfied. It makes sense, right? The idea of a cautionary tale involving a slippery slope existing everywhere. One slip up and you can descend into the depths of depravity. This seemed to be where the Wendigo legend originates, and since then the Wendigo name has been used to denote a mental illness. Wendigo psychosis is said to be the uncontrollable craving for human flesh, even if other options are available. Often reported in the northeastern American tribes, it started to die out once folks began to study and write about it. This caused a lot of folks to become skeptical, but the idea lived on. Plenty of tales concerning this sudden cannibalism have turned up over the years, and whether an actual Wendigo spirit has possessed these individuals or if they're just experiencing a psychotic break is hard to say. There's an account from some Jesuit missionaries traveling through New France back in the 19th century where they came across some men with the mysterious psychosis. Keep in mind, these missionaries were likely deliberately painting any First Nations peoples as savages in need of religion, so maybe take this with a grain of salt. They claimed in their report that they met men so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily the more they eat. I mean, that does sound like a Wendigo, doesn't it? And coming in at number 1, we've got Swift Runner. This is a man who claimed to have been possessed by a Wendigo. It seems that he was generally well liked in his community. A Cree man, he was a tour guide that assisted visitors. In the late 1870s, he and his family moved into the woods. Unseen from the winter of 1878 until the spring of 79, the man came back and claimed that his family succumbed to starvation during the harsh winter. He did not look worse for wear though. Suspicious of the supposedly starving man, folks went to find his campsite, and when they got there, they were horrified to discover human bones, picked clean and hollowed out. There was even a skull with a shoe in it. After this, Swift Runner admitted to cannibalizing his family. Didn't appear to be totally necessary either. There were posts nearby that they could have used to get supplies, and the option to return to the community was still on the table. The answer to whether a Wendigo spirit had actually overtaken him died with him though, as he was hanged for his transgressions. Cannibalism is scary enough on its own, but the idea of a Wendigo makes it that much worse.